Women, until very recently, did not have pleasant lives. Of course, in much of the world they still have a bad deal, but that's a different video. In most societies, they were not legally able to own property or manage their own affairs. Without effective birth control, many spent their lives perpetually impregnated. Furthermore, poor medical practices usually meant a great number died in childbirth. Victorian England also had a serious problem with sex trafficking, which is unfortunately still a global problem covered in a previous video. Young women were being kidnapped and sold into slavery with alarming frequency. It was finally stopped when a feminist and a newspaper editor teamed up to expose this horrible reality by purchasing a sex slave. This week on Bad Things in History, we tell you their story. How it was done. The Pall Mall Gazette, in July 1885, published a series of disturbing interviews. One woman, who was responsible for finding young girls and forcing them into a life of prostitution, gave the following account. I engaged her to be my little maid at the lodgings where I was staying. The very next day I took her off with me to London, and her mother never saw her again. What became of her? A gentleman paid me £13 for the first of her soon after she came to town. She was asleep when he did it, sound asleep. To tell the truth, she was drugged. It is often done. I gave her a drowse. It is a mixture of laudanum and something else. Sometimes chloroform is used, but I always used either snuff or laudanum. We call it drowse or black draught, and they lie almost as if dead. And the girl never knows what has happened till morning. And then? Oh, then she cries a great deal from pain, but she is mazed and hardly knows what has happened except that she can hardly move from pain. Of course we tell her it is all right. All girls have to go through it sometime, that she is through it now without knowing it, and that it is no use crying. It will never be undone for all the crying in the world. She must now do as the others do. She can live like a lady, do as she pleases, have the best of all that is going, and enjoy herself all day. If she objects, I scold her and tell her she has lost her character. No one will take her in. I will have to turn her out on the streets as a bad and ungrateful girl. The result is that in 9 cases out of 10, or 99 out of 100, the child, who is usually under 15, frightened and friendless, her head aching with the effect of the drowse and full of pain and horror, gives up all hope, and in a week she is one of the attractions of the house. A brothel keeper was also happy to share his thoughts on the trade. How is it done? Why, after courting my girl for a time, I proposed to bring her to London to see the sights. I bring her up, take her here and there, giving her plenty to eat and drink, especially drink. I take her to the theater, and then I contrive it so that she loses her last train. By this time, she is very tired, a little dazed with the drink and excitement, and very frightened at being left in town with no friends. I offer her nice lodgings for the night. She goes to bed in my house, and then the affair is managed. My client gets his maid, I get my 10 or 20 pounds commission, and in the morning, the girl, who has lost her character and dare not go home, in all probability will do as the others do and become one of my marks. That is, she will make her living in the streets, to the advantage of my house. The brothel keeper's profit is, first, the commission down for the price of a maid, and secondly, the continuous profit of the addition of a newly seduced, attractive girl to his establishment. That is a fair sample case of the way in which we recruit. Another very simple mode of supplying maids is by breeding them. Many women who are on the streets have female children. They are worth keeping. When they get to be 12 or 13, they become merchantable. For a very likely mark of this kind, you may get as much as 20 or 40 pounds. The public was shocked to learn just how common sexual slavery was in Victorian England. But why did this system exist? And who could fix it? The legal reality. In the 1860s, English law was more concerned with protecting women of the aristocracy than the poor or middle class. Even within the upper class, their role was mostly limited to perpetuating family lines by having children. Although unmarried women could own property, once they married, all legal rights transferred to the husband. Several laws were modified in 1861, and these included laws about offenses against women. The protections were weak, to say the least. Having sex with a girl under 10 was a felony, but it was only a misdemeanor if she was between 10 and 12. The age was later raised to 13 after years of debates. Girls who were over 13 had almost no protection under the law. If they didn't have families to protect their interests, then it was quite possible to fall into a life of prostitution. Many of them didn't choose it, but were kidnapped and forced into it. Others did join the profession voluntarily, sort of. Another feature of the Victorian era is that society began placing a focus on the ideal woman. This greatly restricted the professions where women could find work. Additionally, the jobs that were available required long hours and provided low pay. Many middle-class women fell into prostitution out of necessity, as it was the only profession that paid enough to support them. The underlying problems with prostitution and sex trafficking also created an epidemic of venereal disease. The way leaders dealt with it was to pass the Contagious Disease Act in 1864. The act allowed police officers to arrest women suspected of being prostitutes. Women were then subjected to a compulsory examination for venereal disease. If infected, they could be confined until it was treated. Overcrowding and lack of funds usually meant these facilities created more diseases than they cured. Of course, men were also spreading venereal disease by visiting prostitutes, but they were not subjected to examinations or forced treatment. The wealthy feminist. Although poor women suffered the most in Victorian society, they had few opportunities to change their circumstances. The legal system was biased against them, and the general public was generally unconcerned. Despite this, one upper-class woman would adopt the cause as her own. Josephine Butler was a feminist and social reformer who spent the last half of her life campaigning for women's rights. She advocated giving women the right to vote, allowing them to own property within marriage, and the freedom to not be sold into prostitution. She was also against suspected prostitutes having to undergo medical exams when men did not. Josephine was born in April of 1828. Her family was financially secure and socially progressive. It is little surprise that Josephine had a strong moral opinion about the treatment of women. She married a teacher, and they had 4 children together. Their youngest daughter died from a fall, which changed Josephine's priorities in life. She became interested in social causes that affected women and began her activist career with campaigning against the Contagious Disease Act in 1869. As she investigated the effect of these restrictive laws, Josephine discovered that some of the prostitutes were as young as 12. And she also found there was a slave trade that bought and sold these young women daily. It would take more than one person to fix an underground slave market. In 1885, Josephine met Florence Soper Booth. Florence was the daughter-in-law of William Booth, who founded the Salvation Army. This fateful meeting convinced Josephine Butler to take up the cause of exposing child prostitution and sex slavery in a way the public couldn't ignore. The way she chose to do this was by enlisting the help of William Thomas Stead, who was the editor of the Pall Mall Gazette. The Criminal Editor. William Thomas Stead was more than happy to help educate the public about the way women were being exploited. He started this effort by interviewing Howard Vincent, who was the head of the Criminal Investigation Department. The response from Vincent was not encouraging. Stead wrote of the exchange later, "But," I said in amazement, Then do you mean to tell me that in very truth, actual rapes, in the legal sense of the word, are constantly being perpetrated in London on unwilling virgins, purveyed and procured to rich men at so much a head by keepers of brothels? Certainly, said he. There is not a doubt of it. Why, I exclaimed, the very thought is enough to raise hell. It is true, he said, and although it ought to raise hell, it does not even raise the neighbors. Stead decided that if he was going to have an impact, then he needed to demonstrate that he could buy an underage girl. Perhaps the authorities would care if someone broke the law openly then wrote about it. William Stead got in contact with Bramwell Booth, the head of the Salvation Army. He in turn contacted his wife Florence Booth, who then got in touch with Josephine Butler. Butler's assistant, Rebecca Jarrett, was a reformed prostitute. Butler agreed to let her meet with Stead, though she didn't understand the reason for the request until much later. Stead asked Jarrett to help him show the world that a 13-year-old girl could be bought from her parents and transported out of the country. Jarrett was hesitant, but eventually agreed to help. Jarrett met an old associate who told her about a 13-year-old girl named Eliza Armstrong. Eliza's mother, Elizabeth, was an alcoholic and needed money. Jarrett met Elizabeth and told her that Eliza would serve as a maid to an old gentleman. Jarrett thought the implication of Eliza being sold into prostitution was clearly implied. A deal was reached, and Eliza was sold for the modern equivalent of £534. Rebecca Jarrett then took Eliza to a woman who performed abortions. She confirmed Eliza was still a virgin. After that, Jarrett was given a bottle of chloroform. She took Eliza to a brothel and used the chloroform to lightly drug Eliza. Eliza was meant to await the arrival of her purchaser. The purchaser was William Stead. Stead walked into the room and waited for Eliza to wake up. When Eliza awoke, she started screaming. Stead left the room, and after that, Eliza was handed over to Bramwell Booth. Booth had her taken to France, where she was raised by a family that was participating in the Salvation Army mission. Now that the crime was complete, Stead began to write his story. Publication and trial. On July 6, 1885, Stead published the first installment of a series he called The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon. The article was 6 pages long and explained how sex trafficking and prostitution was happening right under the noses of law enforcement. It even suggested many of them were complicit. The article was an instant hit. The distributor of newspapers in England, who had a monopoly at the time, refused to sell Stead's paper because of the lurid content. Volunteers, including members of the Salvation Army, took over distribution. The series created such chaos that the Home Secretary asked Stead to stop publishing the series. Stead said he would if the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 was passed. It contained measures which would help alleviate some of the issues facing women, which is why Stead made this demand. The government was unable to comply, so William Stead kept printing stories. Although Stead was successful with creating a public reaction, his strategy had serious, unintended consequences. Rival newspapers investigated the stories and discovered that Stead was the one who purchased the girl in the story. He didn't use her real name in the articles, but Stead's rivals still uncovered the truth. On October 23rd, Stead, Jarrett, and one other defendant were brought to trial. Stead and Jarrett were unable to prove that Eliza's mother knew she was selling her daughter into slavery. So, William Stead and Rebecca Jarrett were found guilty of abduction and procurement. Jarrett was sentenced to 6 months in prison, and Stead was given 3 months. Obviously, women were still not equal under the law. Nobody knows what happened to Eliza after she returned from France. Criminal Law Amendment Act. William Stead did succeed in forcing politicians to act. On August 14, 1885, they passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act. It finally modified the law to help prevent sex trafficking. Some of the notable changes included raising the age of consent to 16, punishing anyone who allowed prostitution to take place in their residence, and for brothels to be shut down more easily. The law had an immediate positive effect. After it was passed, the number of reported cases grew astronomically. Authorities were inundated with complaints about prostitution and child molestation on a large scale and had to act rather than ignore it. Unfortunately, Victorian morality did cause other issues. The root cause of problems with prostitution was thought to be male lust. To try and address this, one of the things outlawed in the Criminal Law Amendment Act was homosexuality. Specifically, it said gross indecency between males was not permitted. Alan Turing, who is one of the founders of modern computer science, was convicted under this law in the 1950s. The punishment he received eventually drove him to suicide. Thankfully, the law has since been repealed. William Thomas Stead had good intentions, but do the ends justify the means? Josephine Butler continued to fight for women's rights until her death in 1906. Had Stead not provided his assistance, it's possible Butler would have still won the battle, though, later. Stead's efforts to create publicity did force politicians to act, but did it justify purchasing Eliza and taking her to a brothel? Even if he didn't touch her, it is still abuse by any definition. The real question is whether doing bad things for good reasons is the right choice. What do you think? Are you for William Thomas Stead or against him? Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.